Good morning. I would like to express at first my warmest thanks to the organizers for this kind invitation to speak here. And I have a special thought for Thomas Arzt, who was a friend of mine. The topic of my lecture, as you see, Death and the Dead, reflections on a figure of thought in Jung's Rotes Buch. You can remember yesterday, someone among the participants asked the question, but who are the dead in the Rotes Buch? I think this is an interesting question, and perhaps we can try to find some elements of answer, and this will be one purpose of my lecture. So I would like to bring some short introductory remarks. The four already published volumes of the series Jungs Rotes Buch for Our Time, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt, have sought to bring out the contemporary relevance of Jung's Rotes Buch or Liber Novus. The dramatic events that have occurred in Eastern Europe over the past few weeks have confirmed the validity of their hypothesis. Jung's reflections on evil, on the value of religions, on individual freedom, and the integration of individuals into a community have a striking resonance with our current collective concerns. His thinking, Jung's thinking about death is no exception. The Rotes Buch, as it was published, includes in its third part the scrutinies. In the third part, the scrutinies, the famous 7 Sermons to the Dead, which had been self-published in 1916 and were then intended only for a selected few. They are presented as the teachings in the Rotes Buch of the old wise man Philemon to a group, quoting, returned from Jerusalem, who had not found there what they were looking for. In the part scrutinies of the Rotes Buch, the dead no longer have the exclusively passive position they had in the 1916 version, in which they were being lectured by the Gnostic teacher Basilides of Alexandria. In scrutinies, they also react to Philemon's words. They express their perplexity and they ask questions. They nevertheless remain unfinished souls, in German, in the German text, unvollendete, that is, souls that have not been able to find deliverance, as Jung confirmed in his memoirs, Erinnerungen, Träume, Gedanken, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which was published at the end of his life. Yet the reading of the Rotes Buch in its entirety reveals that death and the dead, not only the dead, but also death and the dead are ubiquitous presences in the 3 parts of the book, where they reappear obsessively in varied guises. Death is mentioned in several of the narrative passages which have a didactic aim and are written in the second person, du, as they address the reader and beyond him, any individual subject, the European subject in general. Moreover, dead people, die Toten, appear either in the same narrative passages or also in the dialogues, taking on the role of full-fledged characters. The Red Book indeed combines the three literary genres as it alternates between narrative, dramatic, and lyrical passages. The lexical field of death is thus the most prominent, quantitatively speaking, and can be found with reference to the characters, but also to places related to death, such as temps or hell, and also acts resulting in death, murder, sacrifice, suicide. The theme of death is also interconnected with other major subjects addressed in the Red Book, more particularly with the question of evil, with considerations on religion, and especially with the reflection developed on Christ, on Christology. So we can ask, what then is the meaning of this obsession with death in the Red Book? I need to specify that since I have already written extensively on the seven sermons to the dead in my PhD and also in a recent book, I will here today explore other texts from the Red Book in order to give an idea of the full scope of Jung's reflection on death. First, the context in which the texts were written provides us with a partial answer to this question, who are the dead, which is confirmed by some passages in the book. The countless deaths that resulted from the Great War haunted the collective conscience and the thoughts of European intellectuals, many of whom had advocated. I have a problem for showing the next.
Oh, maybe it's.
Sorry.
Yeah,
yeah, so sorry for this. Yes. Je recommence. First, the context in which the texts were written provides us with a partial answer, which is confirmed by some passages in the book. The countless deaths that resulted from the Great War haunted the collective conscience and the thoughts of European intellectuals, many of whom had advocated pacifism, even when they might have been fascinated by the war at the outbreak of the war. Liber Primus opens with the description of the visions that Jung says he had in 1913 and that heralded the devastating war to come. I think yesterday we had this quoting. It happened in October of the year 1913, as I was leaving alone for a journey, that during the day I was suddenly overcome in broad daylight by a vision. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. I saw yellow waves, swimming rubble, and the death of countless thousands. This is a quoting from Capital The Way of What Is to Come. In the chapters that follow, reference to the war is less direct. Also, it remains very strong by implication. Also, there is no reference to any specific event. The evocation of death structures the meaning of the text. It becomes what I would like to design as a figure of thought in the Red Book, and one of the keys to understand the Red Book. In Liber Primus, death is thus evoked first through the violent death of the murdered Germanic hero Siegfried. Secondly, through the death of God, more particularly the death of Christ and his descent into hell. Two interrelated elements, which I will examine in the last part of this paper. The atmosphere is altogether different in Liber Secundus, where the living are entrusted with the duty to listen to the dead and even to deliver them. This part features compact throngs of dead people, as well as individual dead characters directly addressing the narrator. This is also the case in the third part, Scrutinies, ending with the 7 sermons to the dead, which can be understood as the esoteric version of Jung's psychological theory, as I have tried to show in several books. So I come to the first part of this lecture, Accepting Death, a Philosophy of Life in the Red Book. Even so, the Red Book presents a radically different discourse from that of Jung's clinical works. It is still the work of a psychologist. In this sense, the discourse on death is first and foremost aimed at the individual and concerns his relation to the unconscious and the individuation process. In many passages, the narrator advocates acceptance of death as the only condition for a fulfilled life and as a necessary stage in the dynamic of transformation. Like in this quotation, "If I accept death, then my tree greens, since dying increases life. If I plunge into the death encompassing the world, then my buds break open. How much our life needs death." And in such quotation, you also can see that Jung's style is a very poetic style in the Red Book. More than delivering a simple memento mori or repeating Goethe's Stoic maxim, which Pierre Hadot took up as his own, "Do not forget to live," Jung called for establishing a balance between life and death. Death seen not as a physical death, that is the end of an individual's life, but as a modality of existence itself, the opposite corollary of life rather than its end. And we have this idea here in the second quotation. We need the coldness of death to see clearly. Life wants to live and to die, to begin and to end. Life and death must strike a balance in your existence. Today's men need a large slice of death, since too much incorrectness lives in them, and too much correctness died in them. Death drives the dynamic of transformation experienced by the subject during his life, the dynamic of transformation. That's so important in Jung's work. It means giving up ancient certainties and gaining access to a new level of consciousness through the integration of unconscious content. The Red Book, therefore, preaches an existential attitude at odds with the unbridled consumerism and forced extraversion Jung saw manifested in what he calls the spirit of this time in the Red Book. As he was writing the Red Book, Jung had chosen the path of outer death or introversion, and he calls on the reader to follow the same direction. Like in this quotation, "The moon is dead. Your soul went to the moon, to the preserver of souls. Thus the soul moved towards death. I went into the inner death and saw that outer dying is better than inner death. And I decided to die outside and to live within. For that reason, I turned away and sought the place of the inner life." So death teaches how to live and how to see happiness in the smallest things, not only in major achievements or successes. So the quotation, "Joy of the smallest things comes to you only when you have accepted death. But if you look greedily for all that you could still live, then nothing is great enough for your pleasure. And the smallest things that continue to surround you are no longer a joy. Therefore, I behold death, since it teaches me how to live. Yes. And the next quotation goes also in this sense. If you accept death, it is altogether giving, but a frosty night in a vineyard full of sweet grapes. And so I come to the second idea, the second part of this reflection on death in the Red Book, with the title Delivering the Dead, Individuals and the Collective Memory of Humanity. The message I have just described in the first part is understandable enough and belongs to a long-standing tradition in European as well as non-European thought. Yet the reader cannot but be intrigued by another strong assertion the Red Book makes, the idea that not only should we accept death, we should also deliver the dead. While connection between the living and the dead characterized and of some religious worlds, it has become looser in Christian religion. The Day of the Dead is celebrated on November 2nd, for example, in Catholicism, and it has all but vanished in Western secularized societies. The Red Book endows the dead with a real or at least effective existence. To follow Jung's definition of reality, is real what produces effects. Wirklich ist, was wirkt. So we have here this quotation. What the ancients did for their dead. You seem to believe that you can absolve yourself from the care of the dead and from the work that they so greatly demand, since what is dead is past. Do you think the dead do not exist because you have devised the impossibility of immortality? You believe in your idols of words. The dead produce effects. That is sufficient. Wirklich ist, was wirkt. And also in this quotation, greed is the need of the dead, but the God needs no sacrificial prayer. But the dead hear your prayers, since they are still of human nature, and not free of goodwill and ill will. Do you not understand? The history of humanity is older and wiser than you. Was there a time where they were no dead? Vain deception. Only recently have men begun to forget the dead and to think that they have now begun the real life, sending them into a frenzy. So in Liber Novus, dead people produce effects. This is a strong idea in Liber Novus. And they encroach on the world of the living because they need the assistance of the living. That's the idea in the Red Book. They either appear as isolated figures in the Red Book, as individual entities, or, as is most often the case, as collective entities, multitudinous groups or throngs, like in these quotations. Chaos is not single, but an unending multiplicity. It is not formless, otherwise it would be single, but it is filled with figures that have a confusing and overwhelming effect due to their fullness. These figures are the dead, not just your dead. That is all the image of the shapes you took in the past, which your ongoing life has left behind, but also the thronging dead of human history, the ghostly procession of the past, which is an ocean compared to the drops of your own life span. The I, that is the major figure in one of the major figures in the Red Book, also meets that characters, personifications of death, like in this quotation from Capital Death. Someone is standing here on the last dune. He is wearing a black wrinkled coat. I think there is also a picture of this figure. He stands motionless and looks into the distance. He answered, "Stranger, you may well stand by me if it is not too cold for you. As you see, I am cold and my heart has never beaten." In a very impressive passage situated in the fourth sections of Scrutinies, the I also meets a young dead girl, the repository of the mysteries of ancient Egypt, who, after a long dialogue with the I, will end up invoking the dead in his place. This is what this young girl says. "You dead, I call you. You shades of the departed, who have cast off the torment of living, come here. Come, you dark and restless ones. I will refresh you with my blood. Come, you dark and restless ones. I will refresh you with my blood, the blood of a living one, so that you will gain speech and life in me and through me." Very impressive, I think. The speaker of the Red Book's I is forced to listen to them, to welcome the dead, and to try to answer their requests. So he says, live the life of the day, and do not speak of mysteries, but dedicate the night to bringing about the salvation of the dead. That's what the narrator tells. For the dead need salvation. The number of the unredeemed dead has become greater than the number of living Christians. Therefore, it is time that we accept the dead. And the wise man Philemon, who is in possession of supreme meaning. Supreme meaning, that's the translation in English of the German word Übersinn. And Übersinn is a word that does not exist in dictionaries, you know, in German. And the translation chose supreme meaning. I think it's interesting, but perhaps we can reflect, is it really supreme meaning? The wise man Philemon, who is in possession of this Übersinn, is referred to, quotation, as a teacher and a friend of the dead. Philemon is a teacher and a friend of the dead. And so the I tells him, "Oh, Philemon, you are a teacher and a friend of the dead. They stand singing in the shade of your house. They live under the branches of your trees," in the garden of Philemon. "They drink the dew of your tears. They warm themselves at the goodness of your heart. They hunger after the words of your wisdom, which sounds full to them, full of the sounds of life." This is from the capital, The Magician, in Liber Secundus. These dead people who have not been delivered yet are considered to be still of human nature. And I think we have to reflect about this. Are the dead still of human nature? But who are they exactly? In this contribution to volume 2 of the series, in his contribution to volume 2 of the series Jung's Red Book for Our Time, entitled "What Do the Dead Seek Today?", Al Collins, we heard him yesterday with Elaine Molchanov, Al Collins paid attention to some of these passages in which the dead are mentioned, and he interpreted them as contents of the collective unconscious, which every individual must face in the course of the individuation process. They represent indeed an individual's dead parents, relatives, or ancestors, or beloved people, to whom he is still connected beyond death. But beyond that first level of meaning, the dead also represent parts of collective memory, of our collective memory. Quotation, the ghostly procession of the past. Delivering them means then undertaking a work of collective remembering, which individuals as well as societies need to accomplish to be able to face their past and its disasters, and also their present. This call remains a needed one in the times we are living today, more than a century after the Red Book was written. And so I come to my third and last part, killing the hero, dying with Christ. The different confrontations with death and the dead that have been described so far are devoid of violence. You cannot find any violence in these quotations I brought. Yet, the Red Book is a very violent text, as I will now demonstrate by dealing with different strands of the topic. One of the most violent features of the text is, of course, the reference to the Great War, which Jung interprets from the perspective of collective as well as individual psychology, in a context when crowd psychology had been developing from the turn of the 20th century to the 1930s, for example, in the work of Gustave Le Bon in France. Jung suggests that tragic events, such as the Great War, which caused terrible destructions and numerous deaths, were allowed to happen because mankind was not yet individuated as a collective entity, and neither were the individuals that constitute it. And so I think this quotation is interesting. As a man, you are part of mankind, and therefore you have a share in the whole of mankind, as if you were the whole of mankind. If you overpower and kill your fellow man who is contrary to you, then you also kill that person in yourself and have murdered a part of your life. Yesterday we had this quotation in a contribution. The spirit of this dead man follows you and does not let your life become joyful. You need your wholeness to live onward. The chapters descend into hell in the future, splitting of the spirit, and the conception of the god from Liber Primus, deal with the death of the hero. They refer to the German hero Siegfried, who in a psychological perspective represents the heroic posture of self-affirmation, of affirmation of the ego. It must be sacrificed to give way to individual and collective transformation. The hero in me must die for a new position to be born. On this topic, you can also read Paul Brucher's contribution to volume 3 of the series. Quotation. Oh, said Siegfried, blonde and blue-eyed, the German hero, had to fall by my hand, the most loyal and courageous. Finally, the discourse on death reaches a climax in the evocation of the death of Christ. Christ, who is a very important person in the Red Book, as you know, Christ is called the greatest among the dead, as he made the supreme sacrifice to allow the birth of a new God. So the first quotation here, besides the dead, place Christ, who was the greatest among them. It was too little for him to break the world, so he broke himself. In the contribution I made to a previous volume of the series edited by Murray and Thomas, I focused on Christology in the Red Book, and I tried to show that the main idea, which recurs throughout the whole book, the whole Red Book, is that one should not try to imitate Christ, but to follow his path, which precisely consisted in not imitating anybody, but only following his own way. In this quotation, for only one was Christ, and only one could violate the laws as he did. Break the Christ in yourself, so that you may arrive at yourself. Breaking the Christ in oneself means breaking the model the church presents as a model to imitate. And far from imitating Christ, the I in the Red Book is called on to identify with Christ. So not imitate, but identify with Christ through active imagination and to suffer his death. We have here also mystical practice, of course, that also exists in Catholicism. Quotation, because I also want my being other, I must become a Christ. I am made into Christ, I must suffer it. And we have this image of crucifixion of the I in the Red Book. The murder of the hero, as well as the identification to Christ, are symbolic postures of the self, inner attitudes by which the subject performs death by sacrificing the heroic posture or undergoing crucifixion in the active imagination, of course. In both cases, death brings about the possibility of a new form of life and of what is called in the Red Book the birth of a new God. That is the path of what is to come. And so I hope these reflections could try to demonstrate that one of the most structuring features of Liber Novus is the ubiquitous and multifaceted presence of death. Death is indeed interconnected with all the main subjects addressed in the book. And the 7 sermons to the dead, that most special of the sections of the book, I think it appears in a new light when it is linked to these other passages from Liber Novus in Liber Primus and Liber Secundus. And so, if we ask, who are the dead that haunt nearly every chapter of the Red Book, I think we can identify several levels of interpretation, 3 levels of interpretation, I would see, but perhaps there are other levels. At first, on the subjective level, and it is perhaps more easy to understand, the dead are a part of each of us. They symbolize the unachieved side of our identity and personality. So far, we didn't get in contact with the self. So far, we didn't get enough in contact with the self. They remain dead parts of our identity and personality. And Philemon, who teaches the dead in scrutinies, in the 7th sermon of the dead, or Basilides, who teaches them in the first version of the text, Philemon and Basilides are symbols or personifications of this self, who doesn't need to believe because he knows. Jung said, I don't believe, I know. Ich glaube nicht, ich weiß. He told this in an interview late in his life, but we have this attitude of Jung, of course, in the Red Book. At the second level, there is also, I think, an interpretation of the dead at a more objective level. It seems possible. As Goethe said in the second part of Faust, that Jung loved a lot. Goethe says, the world of ghosts is not closed. Die Geisterwelt ist nicht geschlossen. This is a passage from Faust that Jung liked to quote. He quoted it often. So the idea that we have to deliver the dead, this idea that we find in the Red Book, lets the door open for the question of communication between the living and the dead. And this under modalities that are not defined in the Red Book, and that can vary from one subject to the other. And the third aspect, if we pay attention also to the very important religious message of the Red Book, we also must consider that the dead of the seven sermons are told to be Christians. They are Christians. And this opens a third level of interpretation. These Christians who came back from Jerusalem, where they didn't find what they were looking for, these Christians are all those who can no more recognize themselves in the message of the churches and in the message of confessional religions. And so Philemon teaches them the way of an other living of religion, an individual living of religion that transcends the confessional level, and perhaps that transcends the diversity also of religion. Yes. To conclude, in his memories, dreams, and reflections, Jung dedicated a chapter to the question of the life after death. In this chapter, that is really well known, his vision of the relations between the living and the dead looks astonishingly very close with the one he developed in Liber Novus. He still thinks that the degree of consciousness one reached during his life cannot increase after death. That's the reason why the dead need the living and ask them for help. And that's why what each of us brings with him into death is so important. Jung's message about death and the relation between the living and the dead is undoubtedly also a very relevant and useful one for our times. And I thank you for your attention.